It's hard to pinpoint when it all started. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to make myself the go-to person for everyone's problems. It just happened. One small act of kindness led to another, and soon enough, I had a reputation for being the one you could count on, the one who would never let you down. Growing up, I liked being needed. It felt good to be the person people turned to when things got rough. I felt important, like I had a purpose. I was the friend who stayed up all night talking through breakups, the sibling who ran errands without a second thought, the colleague who volunteered for the tasks nobody else wanted to do. I thought that was just who I was, someone who helped, someone who made things better. I guess it made me feel special. It's strange to admit it now, but in a way, my identity was built around being the dependable one, the good one. It was like there was an invisible rule book, and my only job was to make sure everyone else was okay. It wasn't a burden back then, it was my purpose. But the thing about being needed is that it never really stops. Once people realize you're willing to bend over backward for them, it's like a switch flips. They don't ask if you're available or if it's a good time. They just expect you to be there, to say yes, to put their needs above your own. And without even realizing it, you start doing it automatically, almost like muscle memory. Someone needs a favor, I'll do it. Someone needs to vent, I'm here. Someone needs help moving, borrowing money, covering for them at work, done. It didn't feel like a problem at first. It felt like love. And maybe that was the first mistake, thinking that being needed meant being loved. One of the earliest memories that should have been a red flag for me was during my last year of high school. There was this kid named Tom. We weren't close, but he knew me well enough to know that I never said no. One day, he came up to me, looking desperate. He said he needed help with his math homework or he'd failed a class. He asked if I could just show him the answers. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do, but he was panicking, and I didn't want to let him down. I remember feeling guilty, but I justified it to myself by thinking, it's just this once. Tom passed the test, and I felt a weird mix of relief and regret. It didn't matter, though. He never talked to me again after that. It was a pattern that repeated over and over throughout my life. I wanted to be someone people could rely on, and I thought that meant always putting myself second, always saying yes. In college, my roommates would constantly ask for favors, small ones at first, like borrowing my car or getting notes from a class I was in. But soon, it turned into being the unofficial housekeeper, the mediator for every petty argument, and the designated driver whenever anyone went out drinking. I never complained. Why would I? They were my friends, and friends helped each other, right? But there were times when I felt a quiet resentment building inside me, a subtle bitterness that I tried to ignore. I didn't understand it back then, and I didn't know how to talk about it. So I buried it and told myself that this was just the cost of being a good friend. The years passed, and the favors kept piling up. By the time I started working my first full-time job, I had grown so accustomed to putting others' needs above my own that it never even crossed my mind to stop. I was the new guy in the office, trying to make a good impression, and I figured that being helpful was the best way to do that. So when my boss asked me to stay late or take on extra assignments, I agreed without hesitation. When my coworkers needed a hand with their projects, I was the first to offer mine. At first, it seemed like my efforts were being noticed. My boss praised me for my work ethic, and my coworkers seemed to appreciate the help. But as time went on, the praise became less frequent, and the requests became more demanding. I found myself staying late almost every night, missing out on weekends, and neglecting my own work to help others meet their deadlines. It wasn't long before I started to feel the strain, both physically and emotionally, but I couldn't say no. It felt impossible. I had built my identity around being the dependable one, and if I stopped, who would I be? What would I be worth? I remember one evening in particular. It was around 8 p.m., and I was still at the office, trying to finish up a report that was due the next day. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend asking if I could help them move some furniture over the weekend. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the exhaustion settling into my bones, but then I typed out the same response I always gave. Of course, I'd be happy to help. I didn't want to disappoint them, and I didn't want them to think I was unreliable. It seemed like a small sacrifice at the time, but looking back, it was just another brick in the wall I was building around myself. The thing is, nobody knew how tired I was, how overwhelmed and stretched thin I felt. I didn't talk about it because I didn't think it mattered. I told myself that I was doing the right thing, that being needed was a good thing. But deep down, a part of me was starting to crack under the pressure. The realization that something was wrong came slowly, in small, quiet moments. I would catch myself feeling resentful towards the people I was helping, even though they had done nothing wrong. They didn't force me to say yes, I chose to. But it was easier to blame them than to face the fact that I had no idea how to set boundaries, no idea how to take care of myself. One weekend, I agreed to help a friend paint their new apartment. It was supposed to be a simple favor, just a few hours of work. But as the day wore on and the hours stretched into the evening, I started to feel a deep sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. My friend didn't seem to notice, and I didn't say anything. I just kept painting, my smile plastered on my face like a mask. When I got home that night, my body ached, and all I wanted to do was sleep. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt this emptiness inside me, this nagging feeling that something was missing. I was doing all the right things, helping all the right people, but it didn't feel right anymore. It felt like I was pouring from an empty cup, trying to give what I didn't have. And yet, I couldn't stop. I was too afraid of what it would mean if I did. As the months passed, I started to notice the subtle ways in which people took my kindness for granted. Friends who only called when they needed something, colleagues who conveniently forgot to mention my contributions, family members who expected me to drop everything at a moment's notice. It wasn't malicious. It was just the way things were, and I didn't have the courage to change it. I told myself that I was doing the right thing, that my goodness was a virtue. But somewhere deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my goodness was slowly becoming something else, something heavy and suffocating, something that was chipping away at who I was. But instead of facing that feeling, I buried it deeper. After all, if being good was all I knew, how could I stop now? They say resentment is a silent thief. It sneaks up on you, slowly, quietly, and by the time you realize it's there, it's already taken something from you. That's how it was for me. For so long, I thought my self-worth came from helping others, from always saying yes and never letting anyone down. But as the demands increased and the thank yous became less frequent, a quiet bitterness began to take root inside me. It wasn't like I woke up one morning feeling resentful. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways, a sigh here, a forced smile there. It was the frustration I felt when someone asked for a favor without acknowledging that it was, in fact, a favor. It was the irritation that crept in when friends assumed I would always be available without ever asking if I actually was. It was the exhaustion of constantly putting everyone else first and getting nothing in return. The people around me didn't notice, of course. Why would they? I was still doing everything they asked, still agreeing to every request, still showing up with a smile on my face. I didn't want anyone to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I didn't want them to know that the person they relied on was starting to unravel. One night, I got a call from an old college friend named Mark. We hadn't spoken in months, and I assumed he was just checking in. But after a few minutes of small talk, he got to the point. He needed a place to crash for a few weeks while he figured out his living situation. His tone was casual, as if he were asking for a glass of water or a ride to the airport. It didn't seem to occur to him that he was asking for something significant. Of course, I heard myself say, the words slipping out automatically. You can stay as long as you need. After I hung up, I felt a knot of anger tighten in my chest. I knew I was supposed to feel good about helping a friend in need. That's what being a good person meant, right? But all I felt was resentment. Resentment towards Mark for asking, and resentment towards myself for agreeing. Over the next few weeks, Mark made himself at home in my apartment. He didn't contribute much, financially or otherwise. He left his dishes in the sink, his clothes on the floor, and his problems at my doorstep. He treated my space like it was his own, and I didn't know how to tell him that it wasn't. I was too afraid of seeming unkind, too worried about being seen as selfish. I tried to convince myself that it was temporary, that I could handle it. But as the days turned into weeks, my patience wore thin. I would come home from work, exhausted and craving some peace and quiet, only to find Mark sprawled on the couch, watching TV or talking loudly on the phone. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him to get out, but I couldn't. The words got stuck in my throat, choked by guilt and fear. Instead, I swallowed my frustration and plastered a smile on my face, pretending that everything was fine. But the resentment kept growing, festering inside me like a wound that wouldn't heal. It wasn't just Mark. My life was full of people like him. People who took and took without ever considering that I might need something in return. Friends who called only when they needed advice or a favor. Family members who expected me to drop everything at a moment's notice. Colleagues who offloaded their work onto me without a second thought. And every time I said yes, every time I sacrificed my own needs for the sake of someone else's, a little piece of me chipped away. But I didn't know how to stop. I had spent my entire life defining myself by my goodness, by my willingness to help. And if I stopped, who would I be? What would I be worth? The breaking point came during a weekend trip with some friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to unwind and recharge. But from the moment we arrived, it became clear that I was expected to be the organizer, the caretaker, the problem solver. I was the one who had to plan the meals, clean up after everyone, and mediate every petty argument. It felt less like a vacation and more like a second job. On the last night of the trip, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat alone on the porch, staring out at the dark woods. The silence was heavy, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my exhaustion. I felt like I was drowning, and no one seemed to notice. Or maybe they noticed, but they didn't care. I wasn't sure which was worse. I thought about all the times I had put myself last, all the times I had said yes when I wanted to say no. I thought about the friends who only called when they needed something, the family members who never asked how I was doing, the colleagues who took credit for my work. And I felt a deep, seething anger. Anger at them for taking advantage of me, but more than that, anger at myself for letting them. That anger was new to me. I wasn't used to feeling it, and I didn't know what to do with it. I had always believed that being good meant being patient, forgiving, and understanding, but there was nothing patient or forgiving about the way I felt that night. I felt betrayed by others and by myself. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, one of my friends made a casual comment about how helpful I had been all weekend. I forced a smile and nodded, but inside, I was screaming. They didn't see me as a friend. They saw me as a convenience, a solution to their problems. And it was my fault. I had let them. On the drive home, I replayed that weekend over and over in my mind, analyzing every interaction, every request, every smile I had faked. I felt like a fraud, pretending to be the good friend, the dependable one, when in reality, I was seething with resentment. But what was I supposed to do? If I stopped helping, if I stopped saying yes, what would be left of me? I had built my entire identity around being the good person, the one who always put others first. And if I let that go, who would I be? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something had to change, because the weight of my resentment was becoming too heavy to bear. But I wasn't ready to confront it yet. So I did what I always did. I buried it. I pushed it down, smiled through the frustration, and told myself that things would get better. That if I just kept helping, kept giving, kept being good, eventually someone would notice. Eventually someone would appreciate it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Deep down, I knew that my goodness was becoming something else, something darker, something twisted, and I didn't know how to stop it. There's a particular kind of hurt that comes from betrayal. A hurt that doesn't just wound you, but shakes your understanding of who you are and what you mean to the people around you. I had spent so long believing that my kindness, my willingness to sacrifice, would earn me a place in people's lives. I thought that being good meant being valued, being loved. But the betrayal that came was a rude awakening, a reminder that not everyone saw my goodness the way I did. Her name was Rachel. We had been friends since college, and I trusted her implicitly. We were different in many ways. Rachel was outgoing, confident, and assertive, while I was quiet and accommodating. But that's what I liked about her. She pushed me out of my comfort zone, encouraged me to take risks, and always seemed to have my back when I needed it. For years, I was the friend Rachel turned to when things went wrong. When she went through a tough breakup, I was there, talking with her late into the night. When she lost her job, I helped her with her resume and gave her a place to stay until she got back on her feet. And when she made mistakes, big ones that cost her friendships and opportunities, I stood by her, even when others didn't. It wasn't that Rachel didn't appreciate me. She did, in her own way. She would thank me profusely after each crisis passed, and for a while, those thank yous were enough. They made me feel like I was doing the right thing, like my sacrifices meant something. But over time, I began to notice a pattern. Whenever things were going well for Rachel, she was distant. Calls went unanswered, plans got canceled, and I was left wondering if I had done something wrong. But when things fell apart, she always came back, looking for comfort, for support, for reassurance. And I always gave it to her, no matter how much it hurt to be the friend she only needed in the bad times. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't a healthy friendship. I knew that Rachel wasn't giving me the same level of care and attention that I was giving her. But I couldn't walk away. I didn't want to be the person who abandoned a friend in need. And I didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe Rachel only kept me around for my willingness to put her first. The breaking point came when Rachel got into some financial trouble. She had made a series of impulsive decisions, and now she was facing a mountain of debt. She came to me, her voice shaking with desperation, and asked if I could lend her some money, just enough to get her through until her next paycheck. It wasn't a small amount. It was enough to make me hesitate, to feel the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. But Rachel looked so desperate, so vulnerable, and I didn't have the heart to say no. So I agreed, telling myself that this was what friends did for each other. That if the roles were reversed, she would do the same for me. Rachel promised to pay me back within a month. She even signed a handwritten note, just to make it official. I didn't think much of it at the time. I trusted her, and I believed that she valued our friendship as much as I did. But as the weeks passed, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. Rachel stopped answering my calls and texts, and when I did manage to reach her, she always had an excuse, a work emergency, a family crisis, a bad day that left her too drained to talk. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I tried to be patient, telling myself that she was going through a tough time and needed space. But then, one day, I saw something that shattered any illusions I had left. I was scrolling through social media when I came across a photo of Rachel at a lavish party, smiling and carefree, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. The caption mentioned a new job, new friends, and a fresh start. There was no sign of the debt, the crisis, or the gratitude she had expressed when she asked for my help. My heart sank. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and foolishness wash over me, each emotion stronger than the last. I tried to tell myself that there was an explanation, that maybe she had gotten lucky or found a way out of her financial troubles. But deep down, I knew the truth. Rachel had taken advantage of me. She had used my kindness to get what she needed, and now that things were better, she had no intention of paying me back, or even acknowledging what she had done. I confronted her a few days later, feeling a nervous energy that made my hands shake. I didn't want to accuse her of anything. I just wanted to understand. I asked her about the money, about the promise she had made, and about why she had been avoiding me. Rachel's reaction wasn't what I expected. She laughed, a short, bitter laugh that made my stomach turn. "You're really gonna hold that over my head?" she said, her tone dismissive. "I thought you were my friend." Her words cut deeper than I could have imagined. I had given so much of myself to Rachel, sacrificed my time, my energy, and now my money, all because I believed in our friendship. And in the end, she made me feel like I was the one in the wrong. As if my expectations of being repaid were unreasonable, as if my hurt was an inconvenience. I wanted to argue, to explain how much I had given and how little I had received in return. But the words wouldn't come. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, all the air knocked out of me. So I just stood there, silent and defeated, as Rachel turned and walked away without a second glance. After that, everything changed. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me was broken by that betrayal. I started to question everything, my motives, my choices, and the way I had lived my life up to that point. I wondered if my kindness had always been misplaced, if my sacrifices had always been in vain. I felt like a fool, like I had spent my entire life pouring myself into relationships that were only one-sided. The worst part wasn't losing the money, or even losing the friendship. The worst part was losing my sense of self. I had always believed that being good, being selfless, was what gave me value. But now I wasn't sure what any of it meant. If my goodness could be used against me, if it could lead to betrayal and pain, then what was the point? I withdrew from my friends and family, unable to trust my own judgment or the intentions of those around me. I stopped answering calls, stopped reaching out, stopped offering help. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more like a defense mechanism, a way to protect myself from being hurt again. But the isolation only made the pain worse. I felt like I was trapped in a cycle of doubt and regret, replaying every decision I had ever made, every act of kindness that had gone unappreciated or exploited. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know how to find my way back to the person I used to be. The betrayal had shattered something inside me, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. When trust is broken and your goodness is repaid with betrayal, the immediate sting of that moment eventually gives way to something heavier, something far more insidious: guilt. Not the guilt of doing something wrong, but the kind that makes you question if, by simply being who you are, you set yourself up to be taken advantage of. I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe I was responsible for what had happened, that my willingness to help, my need to be needed, was what led me down this path. After Rachel's betrayal, it wasn't just my trust in others that had been shaken, it was my trust in myself. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Was I too naive, too trusting, too willing to sacrifice for people who wouldn't do the same for me? The questions kept me up at night, lingering long after the lights had gone out. And in those long, dark hours, I began to internalize the blame. It wasn't rational. I knew that, on some level. But guilt isn't rational, it's emotional. And emotions are stubborn things. They don't care about logic or reason. They only care about what they feel. One of the hardest parts was facing the people who genuinely cared about me, my family, my close friends. They noticed the change in me, of course. I had become quieter, more withdrawn, and they tried to reach out, but their concern only deepened my guilt. I couldn't tell them what had happened with Rachel. I couldn't admit that I had let someone walk all over me, that I had given so much of myself to someone who didn't value it. It felt like admitting a failure, like confessing to a sin I couldn't name. Instead, I made excuses. I told them I was busy, that work was overwhelming, that I just needed some time to myself. They accepted my explanations at first, but as the days turned into weeks and my isolation deepened, they began to push for answers. One evening, my younger sister, Emily, showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't seen her in weeks, and I wasn't prepared for her sudden appearance. She stood in the doorway, looking worried and determined, and for a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. But she called out my name, and I didn't have the energy to keep up the charade. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You've been avoiding everyone. Mom and Dad are worried, and so am I." I wanted to brush her off, to tell her everything was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt a lump rise in my throat, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the urge to cry. I hadn't let myself cry over Rachel, over the betrayal, over anything. I had been too busy blaming myself. Emily walked into the apartment and closed the door behind her. She sat down on the couch, looking at me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly. "Just tell me what's going on." And so, I told her. I told her about Rachel, about the money, about the dismissal and the laughter. I told her about the sleepless nights and the endless questions that haunted me. And as the words spilled out, I felt a strange mix of relief and shame. Relief at finally being able to speak, and shame at admitting my vulnerability. When I finished, Emily didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, absorbing everything I had said. I could see the anger in her eyes, not anger at me, but at Rachel, at the way I had been treated. But she didn't dwell on that. Instead, she reached for my hand and squeezed it. "It's not your fault," she said firmly, her voice breaking through the silence. "You didn't do anything wrong." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to accept her words and let them soothe the guilt that had taken root inside me. But it wasn't that simple. How could it be? I had spent so much of my life believing that being good, being selfless, meant something. And now it felt like that belief had been turned against me. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of everything. I went through the motions of my daily life, but the questions still lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I began to withdraw even further, not just from my friends and family, but from the things that once brought me joy. I stopped volunteering, stopped reaching out, stopped doing the little acts of kindness that had once defined me. I told myself it was self-protection, that I needed to guard myself against future betrayals. But the truth was, I didn't know how to reconcile my need to help others with the reality of being hurt by them. It wasn't just Rachel's betrayal that haunted me. It was every moment in my life where my kindness had been taken for granted, every friendship that had faded when I was no longer useful, every sacrifice that had gone unnoticed. I began to question whether my entire life had been built on a lie, whether my goodness was in fact a weakness. The guilt twisted itself into something darker, something that felt like shame. I began to see my kindness not as a virtue, but as a flaw, a character defect that had led me down a path of pain and disappointment. I felt foolish for believing that being good was enough, that it could protect me from the harshness of the world. And in that darkness, I began to withdraw even from myself. I stopped reflecting, stopped questioning, stopped trying to make sense of my emotions. I let the guilt consume me because it was easier than confronting the truth, that my goodness had become something else entirely, something heavy and burdensome, something that made me feel like I was at fault for my own suffering. But as much as I tried to bury it, the guilt kept rising to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. It was a constant, nagging presence, whispering in my ear that I had brought this on myself, that I had allowed my goodness to be weaponized against me. And the more I listened to that voice, the more isolated I became. My friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. I didn't want to burden them with my pain, and I didn't want to risk being hurt again. I had convinced myself that I was the problem, that my kindness was a sin I needed to atone for. And so I chose solitude, hoping that in my isolation I could find a way to make sense of everything. But isolation isn't the same as healing. It's just another form of avoidance, another way to keep the pain at bay without actually confronting it. And as the days turned into weeks, I realized that my guilt wasn't going to disappear on its own. I couldn't keep running from it, and I couldn't keep blaming myself for the choices of others. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself staring at a photo on my wall, a photo of me and Rachel from years ago, smiling and carefree. I didn't recognize the person in the photo. They seemed so distant, so naive. I wanted to rip the photo down, to erase the memory of what had once been. But instead I reached for it and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just tired. Tired of blaming myself. Tired of carrying the weight of guilt that didn't belong to me. I knew that I couldn't change what had happened, and I couldn't erase the mistakes I had made. But maybe, just maybe, I could stop punishing myself for them. It wasn't a moment of revelation, and it wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was just a small step, a decision to stop carrying the burden of guilt that wasn't mine to bear. And in that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of hope. Hope that maybe one day I could learn to forgive myself. The journey to set boundaries wasn't smooth or easy. It felt like learning a new language, one I hadn't been taught growing up. For most of my life, my value had been tied to being accommodating, self-sacrificing, and agreeable. I thought that being good meant being everything to everyone. But I'd learned the hard way that this wasn't sustainable. It wasn't kindness, it was self-neglect. After weeks of wrestling with guilt and isolation, I made the choice to start setting boundaries. Small ones at first, like saying no to favors that made me uncomfortable or declining social invitations when I was exhausted. It sounds simple now, but at the time, it felt monumental. Saying no had always been my greatest fear, as if rejecting someone else's need would erase my worth. But the first real test came at work. It was during a team meeting when my manager, Paul, asked me to take on an additional project. It wasn't in my scope of work, and it wasn't something I had the capacity to handle at the time. I felt the familiar anxiety rise in my chest, the urge to say yes and keep the peace. But I knew I couldn't keep going down that road. Not anymore. So I took a deep breath and said, "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I don't have the bandwidth to take on more right now." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul looked surprised, almost taken aback, and for a moment, I regretted my words. I wanted to backtrack, to offer some kind of excuse or apology. But instead, I held my ground, reminding myself that setting boundaries wasn't wrong, it was necessary. To my surprise, Paul nodded and moved on without further comment. The world didn't collapse, and no one held my refusal against me. It was a small victory, but it was a start. But the real challenge came when I began to set boundaries with the people closest to me. Friends and family who had grown accustomed to me always saying yes, always being available, always putting them first. I knew that changing the dynamics of those relationships wouldn't be easy, and I wasn't wrong. One of the hardest conversations I had was with my mother. She had always relied on me for emotional support, often venting about her problems and expecting me to listen and offer advice. I didn't mind being there for her, but it had reached a point where it felt like I was carrying her burdens alongside my own. It wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't fair. One afternoon, after a long and emotionally draining phone call, I took a deep breath and said, "Mom, I love you, and I'm always here for you. But sometimes I need a break. I can't always be the person you vent to. It's overwhelming for me." My mother's reaction wasn't what I had hoped for. She seemed hurt, confused, and maybe even a little angry. She didn't say much, but her silence spoke volumes. It made me question whether I was doing the right thing, whether setting boundaries was selfish or cruel. But deep down, I knew it was the only way to protect myself from being overwhelmed. Over the next few weeks, I had similar conversations with friends who had become too reliant on me. And each time, it felt like I was risking the relationships I had worked so hard to maintain. Some friends took it well, expressing understanding and gratitude for my honesty. But others seemed distant or dismissive, as if my refusal to constantly be available was a betrayal. One of the most painful moments came when I confronted Mark, the same friend who had crashed at my apartment and overstayed his welcome without contributing. I had been avoiding the conversation for months, afraid of how he might react, but I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. When I finally sat him down and explained how I felt, Mark's response was defensive. He didn't see the problem, didn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of it. "I thought you were doing it because you cared," he said, his tone tinged with bitterness. "I did," I replied quietly. "But caring about someone doesn't mean sacrificing my own well-being. I need to take care of myself too." Mark didn't seem to understand. He left shortly after, and we haven't spoken much since. Losing that friendship hurt, but it also felt necessary. It was a painful reminder that not everyone would respect my boundaries, and not every relationship was meant to last. But for every relationship that faded, there were others that grew stronger. The people who truly cared about me began to see and appreciate the effort it took for me to set boundaries. They didn't push back or guilt me. They respected my choices and supported me in my journey to find balance. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always smooth, but it was worth it. As I began to prioritize my own well-being, I found that I had more energy and emotional capacity to give to the people who mattered most. I was no longer giving out of obligation or fear of losing their affection. I was giving because I wanted to, because I genuinely cared. The most surprising change was in my relationship with myself. For the first time in years, I started to feel a sense of self-respect and self-compassion. I began to recognize that my worth wasn't tied to how much I could give or how many people I could please. My worth was inherent, independent of anyone else's opinion or approval. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when I felt like I was failing at this new way of being. But each time I slipped back into old habits, I reminded myself of the cost of those habits, the exhaustion, the resentment, the betrayal. And slowly, I began to let go of the guilt that had held me captive for so long. But the journey wasn't without its losses. As I continued to set boundaries and prioritize my own needs, certain relationships fell away. Relationships that had been built on a foundation of one-sided giving and self-sacrifice. It was painful to let go of people who had once been important to me, but I knew it was necessary. I couldn't keep holding on to relationships that drained me, that didn't allow me to be my authentic self. The hardest part was letting go of the idea that being good meant being selfless to the point of self-destruction. I had to redefine what goodness meant to me, not as a constant act of self-sacrifice, but as a balance between caring for others and caring for myself. One day, as I was sitting in a park, reflecting on everything that had happened, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from having everything figured out. It was the peace of knowing that I was finally moving in the right direction. I was no longer defined by my willingness to give at all costs. I was defined by my choice to value myself, to set boundaries, and to find balance in a world that often demanded otherwise. The journey wasn't over, and it never would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I wasn't the person I used to be. The person who always said yes, who always put others first, who believed that goodness was a measure of sacrifice. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned the price of boundaries and chosen to pay it. And for that, I was grateful.